I'll be reading from Isaiah 1. You can sit back and relax. It's a long text. Thanks, John. These are the visions that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. He saw these visions during the years when Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah were kings of Judah. Listen, O heavens, pay attention, earth. This is what the Lord says. The children I raised and cared for have rebelled against me. Even an ox knows its owner, and a donkey recognizes its master's care. But Israel doesn't know its master. My people don't recognize my care for them. Oh, what a sinful nation they are, loaded down with a burden of guilt. They are evil people, corrupt children who have rejected the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel and turned their back on him. Why do you continue to invite punishment? Must you rebel forever? Your head is injured and your heart is sick. You are battered from head to foot, covered with bruises, welts, and infected wounds, without any soothing ointments or bandages. Your country lies in ruins, and your towns are burned. Foreigners plunder your fields before your eyes and destroy everything they see. Beautiful Jerusalem stands abandoned like a watchman's shelter in a vineyard, like a lean-to in a cucumber field after the harvest, like a helpless city under siege. If the Lord of heaven's armies had not spared a few of us, we would have been wiped out like Sodom destroyed like Gomorrah. Listen to the Lord, you leaders of Sodom. Listen to the law of our God, the people of Gomorrah. What makes you think I want all your sacrifices, says the Lord? I am sick of your burnt offerings of ram and the fat of fattened cattle. I get no pleasure from the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to worship me, who asked you to parade through my courts with all your ceremony? Stop bringing me your meaningless gifts, and incense of your offerings disgust me. As for your celebration of the new moon and the Sabbath and your special days of fasting, they are all sinful and false. I want no more of your pious meetings. I hate your new moon celebrations and your annual festivals. They are a burden to me. I cannot stand them. When you lift up your hand in prayer, I will not look. Though you offer many prayers, I will not listen. For your hands are covered with the blood of innocent victims. Wash yourselves and be clean. Get your sins out of my sight. Give up your evil ways. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Help the oppressed. Defend the cause of orphans. Fight for the rights of widows. Come now, let's settle this, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, I will make them as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, I will make them as white as wool. If you will only obey me, you will have plenty to eat. But if you turn away and refuse to listen, you will be devoured by the sword of your enemies. I, the Lord, have spoken. See how Jerusalem, once so faithful, had become a prostitute? Once the home of the righteous and the just, she is now filled with murderers. Once like pure silver, you have become like worthless slag. Once so pure, you are now like watered-down wine. Your leaders and rebels, the companions of thieves, all of them love bribes and demand payoffs. But they refuse to defend the cause of orphans or fight for the rights of widows. Therefore, the Lord of heaven's armies, the mighty one of Israel, says, I will take refuge on my enemies and pay back my foes. I will raise my fist against you. I will melt you down and skim off your slag. I will remove all your impurities. Then I will give you good judges again, and wise counselors like you used to have. Then Jerusalem will again be called the home of the justice and the faithful city. Zion will be restored by justice. Those who repent will be revived by righteousness. But rebels and sinners will be completely destroyed, and those who desert the Lord will be consumed. You will all be shamed of your idol worship in groves of sacred oaks. You will blush because you have worshipped in gardens dedicated to idols. You will be like a great tree with withered leaves, like a garden without water. The strongest among you will disappear like straw. Their evil deeds will be the spark that sets on fire. They and their evil works will burn up together, and no one will be able to put out the fire.
So what would you say is the greatest threat facing us today? I'm going to tick through some options in no particular order. These aren't necessarily ranked in how much I perceive them to be threatening, but I'd be curious to see which of these might resonate for you as the greatest threat that we face today. You can raise your hand if you see yours come up on the screen. You don't have to, though, because some of these could be controversial, so you can keep your opinion to yourselves. We're just going to tick through some possibilities, the greatest threat that we face today. Perhaps it is the COVID-19 pandemic. I kind of thought we were past this one. I thought we had turned the corner. And now within the past few days, I'm beginning to rethink that assessment. Maybe you say, no, COVID isn't actually the biggest threat that we face. The biggest threat that we face today is the threat of governmental overreach. The government infringing on people's rights and freedoms and liberties. Maybe you're worried about this taking the form of particularly progressive policies, socialism or communism. Or maybe you're worried about this taking the form of conservative policies, a form of fascism. Either way, government overreach is the biggest threat that we face today. Or maybe you think at a more macro level and you say, actually, the biggest threat that we face today is global warming. If we don't do something about that, the planet will become uninhabitable. None of us will survive. Or maybe you say, no, global warming isn't actually that big of a threat. What we really need to worry about is critical race theory. This idea that's dividing people based on the color of their skin or their racial identity or ethnic identity. Critical race theory is the biggest threat that we face today. Or maybe you say, actually, no, critical race theory is quite helpful and it helps us expose what is the true biggest threat that we face today, which is systemic injustice. The fact that there are injustices built into the very fabric of our society, perpetuated against people based on their socioeconomic status or their race or ethnicity or their sexual identity and orientation. Systemic injustice is the biggest threat that we face today. Or maybe you're one of those people whose eyes are constantly scanning the horizon, thinking the thing that we really need to be worried about, we don't even necessarily know about yet. Or maybe we're just beginning to understand its implications. So really, the biggest danger that we face today is artificial intelligence. That someone is going to create something that is so powerful that it will have the capacity to eradicate life on Earth. Elon Musk and Bill Gates seem to be pretty worried about this one. Or maybe you say, no, the danger is not necessarily a machine that will do the killing, but the way we've always killed people, what we really need to be worried about, the biggest threat that we face is the threat of military conflict. Well, that's conflict between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China, between Russia and China, between any of the nuclear-armed superpowers. Multiple nations have the capacity to wipe out life on Earth as we know it. And so we really need to be worried about military conflict. So which of these is the biggest threat that we face today? Or maybe for you, it's none of the above. You would point to something completely different that I didn't even think about, like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. That's the real thing that we need to be worried about. In the year 2021, there are all manner of threats that we could point to and analyze and evaluate and try to rank their dangerousness on a scale. But imagine that we had a time machine. Maybe time travel is actually the biggest danger that we face. I don't know. Somebody's going to go back in time and kill my own grandfather and create a paradox that we'll never be able to get out of. But say we had a time machine, and we could jump to any point in time that we wanted and go through a similar exercise. Say we could jump back in time and ask, what is the biggest threat that we face? Say we could jump back 20 years and go back to the year 2001, of the current era, the common era. What do you think people would say is the biggest threat that we face in 2001? Some of this would depend on the accuracy of your time machine. If it was a perfectly calibrated time machine and you could go back exactly 20 years and land on August 1st, 2001 at 11:07 in the morning, people would have a certain set of ideas about how dangerous the world was and what those dangers were. But if your time machine missed by just, say, a couple weeks, 6 weeks, and instead of landing on August 1st, 2001, you landed on September 12th, 2001, almost everyone would agree what the greatest threat facing the world was, and it was the threat of radical Islamic terrorism. But say you jump back in your time machine, you move from September 12th, you said, I just want to make a little hop, skip, and a jump back in time. I don't want to go back 20 years, I just want to go back 2 years, back to 1999. What would be the biggest threat people were worried about then? A lot of people, it would be Y2K. Right? We didn't do a good job programming the computers that would run our lives. We didn't add enough decimal points or enough digit space in the year. And so a lot of computer systems are going to go offline as the clock rolls from 1999 into the year 2000, and planes are going to fall out of the sky, and the electrical grid's going to go down, and natural gas pipelines aren't going to work, and the water supply is going to be contaminated. We'd be really worried about moving into the year Y2K. That's the biggest threat that we face. But say you could jump back again. Let's go back to, say, 1980. This is before my time now, so you're going to have to fill me in. I would speculate that an awful lot of people in 1980 would be worried about the threat of nuclear winter. The Cold War is still sort of ramping up, maybe not quite at its peak, maybe it had declined a little bit since the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there's a very real, palpable sense. Kids would do drills where they would duck under their desk as if that would do anything if a thermonuclear bomb was detonated in the region. But in 1980, people would be very worried. The greatest threat that we face as a species, as a society, the greatest threat that we face is the threat of nuclear war. But again, say your time machine missed just a little bit, and you happen to land on August 1st, 1981. Do you know why that date's significant? I was actually talking with the MYF about this morning, and none of them had any idea what a seismic event happened 40 years ago today. They had no idea, but 40 years ago today, the very first music video was played on MTV. And some of you were raising teenagers during that time, and very quickly you began to think that the biggest threat facing your family, if not the world, was the terrible, terrible things they were learning from MTV. Say we could jump back further, jump back to 1940. People aren't worried about nuclear war yet. They don't understand that that's even a possibility, but people are very concerned about the rise of Hitler in Germany and his quest for land and space for the Germans and dragging the world into an international war. That was the biggest threat that many people would point to facing the world. We could keep doing this exercise, keep going back and back and back and back, discovering different layers, different strata in the archaeological record of what it is that we as humans were worried about at various points in time. But we're going to make a huge jump in our time machine, not just go back 20 or 40 years. We're going to go back several thousand years. We're going to go back to, let's say 540 BCE. It's about 540 years before the birth of Christ. And instead of thinking about what the biggest threat would have been here on this continent, we're going to shift our focus and look at this little stretch of land between the Red Sea and the Jordan River. We're going to ask ourselves, what would the people of that land have thought was the biggest threat facing them that day? And around this time, around the year 540, almost everyone would agree that the biggest thing we need to be worried about is this new, big, powerful empire that's showed up in our region. It's the Persian Empire, and it's headed by a king named Cyrus. And the world has never seen anything like the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire is so powerful that the Persian Empire actually conquered the Babylonian Empire, which seemed impossible because no one had ever seen anything like the Babylonian Empire. But Persia rolls in, and all anyone can think about and talk about is, what is King Cyrus going to do with us? That was the biggest threat people were worried about in 540 BCE. But let's say we jump back even further, back to, say, 609, thereabouts. All these dates are approximate, give or take. Here, nobody had ever heard of the Persian Empire. It wasn't a thing yet, but everyone was very worried about the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was the big, bad power structure that had just moved into the neighborhood. The Babylonian Empire was so powerful that they had defeated the Assyrian Empire. which up until that point had been the biggest, baddest empire anyone had ever seen. The Assyrians almost perfected the very act of being an empire, extracting resources and imposing authority through military dominance. The Assyrians perfected empire, and yet Babylon was more powerful still. And so Babylon shows up, and what are we going to do about these threatening Babylonians? But rewind just a little bit further, say somewhere around 732 BCE. Babylon's not that big of a threat at this point in time, but people are very, very worried about Assyria. Assyria was on the move, coming down from the north, and they had conquered Syria, and they had conquered the northern tribes of Israel, and the people in Judah and the southern kingdom were very worried, what is going to happen with Assyria? What do we do about this powerful empire beating down our doorsteps? But jump back just a little bit further, a couple years. Remember, when we get BCE, the clock goes backwards, so you got to think about that. But jump back just a couple years further, and people in the southern kingdom wouldn't have been so worried about Assyria, but they would have been very, very worried about their neighbors to the north, their kinsmen, the kingdom of Israel, the northern 10 tribes of Israel. They would have been very worried because Israel had formed an alliance with Damascus, and it seemed like they were threatening Jerusalem itself. And this was the existential crisis. This was the end of the world, an army coming in to invade, to conquer, to depose the king and take control. This was the existential crisis. In all of these crises that I've just been describing, the crisis of the Persian Empire under King Cyrus, the crisis of the Babylonian Empire, the crisis of the Assyrian Empire, the crisis of the alliance between the northern tribes and Syria aligning themselves against the southern tribes, all of these crises form the context, the backdrop for the book of Isaiah. And this is the book that we're going to be looking at together as a congregation over the next 5 weeks. Nina said there was a lot of text in Isaiah 1, and she's not wrong, but we're going to actually get through all 66 chapters, not quite word for word, but we're going to go from the beginning of Isaiah to the end and try to understand how God spoke through this prophet in the midst of these crises and how God might be speaking to us. And the first thing you might notice, if you've been paying attention, is that I just described an awful lot of time. We covered roughly 200 years of human history, going back from the rise of Persia all the way back to before the Assyrian conquest. We're looking at roughly 200 years of human history. And all of that is spoken about in the book of Isaiah. Which means that when we read the book of Isaiah, things are going to get weird. They're just going to get weird because there's all sorts of stuff happening in the background that isn't necessarily explicitly described in the text. And so if you just plop yourself into the book of Isaiah and begin reading, it's very easy to say, I have no idea what is actually going on. And that's okay. And it actually gets weirder still because in the Christian tradition, after the arrival of Jesus, as Christians began to try to make sense of what had happened in Jesus, as they believed that God had fulfilled God's promises to send a Messiah to redeem the people, they often would look to the prophet Isaiah and say, oh, this prophecy is finally being fulfilled. Which means we're not talking just about 200 years of human history, we're talking about 700 years of human history. And there's some of us today that we read the prophecies of Isaiah and we say, I'm still not sure this has been fully fulfilled. So perhaps this is covering 2,700 years of human history or even more. So I'm giving you permission as you read the book of Isaiah, which I would encourage you to do. You could actually get through this entire book, all 66 chapters, in a month. If you did just over 2 chapters a day. You already got the first chapter done, so if you just go home and read Isaiah 2, you're in good shape. You can keep that going. So as you read that, I'm giving you permission to be confused. It's totally okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, a bad Christian, uneducated, none of that. It is entirely okay to look at this and say, I have no idea what this man is talking about. And it's worth noting that because we're talking about 200 years plus of human history, it's a little strange to think that one person described all of that. And so one of the ways that we can respond to that dilemma is to say, well, perhaps it's not just that there was one person named Isaiah who wrote all 66 of these books, but perhaps there was a prophet named Isaiah whose prophecies were so influential and meaningful that other people, when they faced similar crises in the future, looked back to the example of Isaiah and allowed God to speak through them just as God spoke through Isaiah. So sometimes in scholarly discourse, as you look at folks who study the New Testament in a scholarly way, they describe not just one Isaiah, but three Isaiahs, a first, second, and third Isaiah. First Isaiah is roughly chapters 1 to 39, dealing primarily with the Assyrian period. And then you have Isaiah 40 to roughly 54, 55, dealing with the Babylonian period. And then the remainder of the book, third Isaiah, dealing with the return from exile as the Jews return back to their homeland after the Persian Empire has shown up and defeated Babylon. Other people say, no, there weren't three Isaiahs, there was just one Isaiah, but he saw clearly into the future. God gave him foresight so that he could see clearly what would happen. And that's entirely possible. I don't know that we need to fully adjudicate that question and come to a decisive answer, but just know that as we read Isaiah, we are looking at a huge span of human history. And it's this series of successive crises. A military alliance formed by your adversaries, followed by an imperial invasion, followed by a different imperial invasion, followed by yet another imperial invasion. But what's amazing is that as you read the book of Isaiah, even though Isaiah is very attuned to what is going on in the world, and is keenly aware of the Assyrian threat, and later on the Babylonian threat, and later on the Persian promise or threat, depending how you want to interpret it. Isaiah is keenly aware of all of that, but what Isaiah does is to remind his audience that none of these crises, none of these threats are of ultimate concern. Instead, what gives unity to the book of Isaiah, spanning all of this human history and all of these different crises, what gives it its unity is that Isaiah, or the prophecies attributed to Isaiah, have one overriding concern in the midst of all of these crises and all of these challenges. There's one thing that truly matters, and it is justice and righteousness. Again and again, Isaiah will return to the question of justice and righteousness. When the kingdom of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, are forming their alliance with Syria, looking to invade the southern kingdom, and Isaiah is prophesying to the southern kingdom, Isaiah is not primarily concerned about this military conquest. Isaiah is concerned about justice and righteousness. And then when the Assyrians show up, first as friend and then as foe, Isaiah is not primarily concerned about the Assyrian threat. Isaiah is concerned about justice and righteousness. And then when Assyria is displaced and Babylon comes in and actually destroys Jerusalem and sends its people into exile, the prophet writing in Isaiah's name in that day is not primarily concerned about the Babylonian threat, but is concerned with justice and righteousness. And when finally King Cyrus comes to power and sends the exiles back to their home to rebuild, Isaiah is not primarily concerned about how are we going to rebuild the temple and how are we going to rebuild the palaces and how are we going to restore the city. Isaiah is concerned about justice and righteousness. Again and again, Isaiah reminds us that the true crisis that we face is not whatever seems to be the most pressing issue of our day, but the true crisis that we face is how easily we forsake justice and righteousness. You can see this in the text that Nina read for us in Isaiah 1, verse 27. Zion shall be redeemed by justice, and those in her who repent by righteousness. What will ultimately resolve the crisis that we face? It is not human ingenuity or human strength or human cleverness. It is justice and righteousness. Now, all of us have in our heads certain working definitions of these terms. These are terms that have been around for a very long time in the English language and in the Latin language before that. And there are certain definitions, certain operating ways of making sense of these terms that have become common and popular. And so it's very easy for us to read those definitions back into the text. And assume that when Isaiah speaks of justice and righteousness, Isaiah meant exactly what I mean by justice and righteousness, or exactly what you mean by justice and righteousness. But that's not actually the case. I want to share with you two definitions that come from a scholar of the Old Testament named John Goldengay, and I find them very helpful in making sense of this. He describes justice this way: justice is the exercise of authority and the making of decisions. The exercise of authority and the making of decisions. Now, this is probably a pretty far cry removed from most of our conceptions, understandings of justice. Justice in our minds has to do with people getting what they deserve, or perhaps people getting what they need. That's what justice is. But really, the root word, what Isaiah was really talking about, was the exercise of authority and the making of decisions. It's the power to act decisively, and then the impact of that decisive action. And when you really stop and think about it, you realize that justice is not inherently, necessarily, a good thing. It is very possible for someone to exercise authority and make decisions that are detrimental decisions, that are harmful decisions. And you actually see this again and again in the book of Isaiah. That there are people who have authority, particularly the kings, who use that authority, who exercise authority and make decisions in unhealthy ways. They make decisions that are to their own self-interest rather than the interest of their community. And so Isaiah, along with many other prophets, pairs justice with righteousness. And when we think about righteousness, we have a tendency to think about our own personal moral standing. This is the legacy of the Reformation. That God has a moral standard that all of us have fallen short of. And so through Christ, God gives us a righteousness or a right standing that we ourselves did not earn. That's why we tend to think about righteousness. It's my own personal moral standing, either based on the gift and grace of God or based on my own moral conduct, or both. That's what we think about when we think about justice. But for Isaiah, when Isaiah writes of justice, Isaiah is speaking primarily relationally. Righteousness is doing the right thing in relation to other people. Righteousness in Isaiah is inherently a relational term. Doing the right thing in relation to other people. So keep these definitions in mind as we hear again what Isaiah promises. Zion shall be redeemed by justice. Zion shall be redeemed by someone who exercises authority and makes decisions. And what Isaiah seems to have in mind, that it is not necessarily a human who will do justice to redeem Zion, but it is God who will do justice. God will exercise authority and make decisions. God will use God's power to make decisions. Zion shall be redeemed by God's decisive action. Those in her who repent by righteousness, doing the right thing in relation to other people. So as God acts decisively, the human response to God's actions is to do the right thing in relation to other people. The overarching concern of the book of Isaiah is not each of these crises that the people are facing, but the question of justice and righteousness. So that raises a question for us. What do we do in a crisis? When we think through this long litany of things that could pose a danger or a threat to human existence or human civilization or to our way of life or to our country or our community or our family, when we think about the dangers that we face, what do we do in a crisis? You think about the COVID-19 pandemic, or you think about the possibility of governmental overreach, you think about global warming, you think about systemic injustice. Think about the threat of military conflict. When you think about all of these things that could pose a threat, that could be dangerous, that could represent a true crisis for us, how do we respond in a crisis? The encouragement, the exhortation of Isaiah is that we focus not necessarily on the crisis itself, but we think, what do I do in relation to this crisis because I am committed to justice and to righteousness? Now, I want you to note that that does not necessarily answer the question. If the question is, what do we do about global warming or global climate change? There may be some very tangible, concrete actions that are prudent and wise and rational. But the primary question that we face is not what do I do in relation to this crisis, but what do I do in relation to justice and to righteousness? So what that means is that our response in a crisis is in part contingent on the power that we have, the authority that we have. What do I actually have? Where do I actually have the ability to exercise authority and make decisions? That's where justice operates and resides for me, within my sphere of influence, to make decisions, to exercise authority. But more significantly, how do I respond to these crises in right relationship with other people? And so maybe we could summarize our response to the crisis like this, in sort of 4 movements. That if we are following the wisdom, the testimony, the teaching of the prophet Isaiah, the first thing that we do in a crisis is we trust God. Again and again, the prophet Isaiah seeks to turn the people's attention away from the threat du jour, the danger of the Assyrian army or the Babylonian army or the Persian army. Isaiah seeks to turn their attention away from the threat and back toward a capacity, a radical capacity to trust in God. And to trust that God will act justly. That God retains the power to exercise authority and to make decisions. We trust that God will act justly. When we face these crises, when we face these threats, we are called to trust that God will act justly. And as we trust that God will act justly, we then can live in right relationship. There's justice and righteousness. We trust God to act justly so that we live in right relationship with all those around us. And the exact scope of this all is contentious. Who exactly is it that falls under the all that we are called to live in right relationship with? Isaiah repeatedly gives 4 test cases. 2 of them are named here in Isaiah 1. You'll hear the other 2 show up as you continue to read through it. But Isaiah says this: learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. So the orphan, the widow, and there are 2 others. There is the stranger or alien or immigrant, and the poor. Some people call this the quartet of the Old Testament. As you read the prophets, you hear them call again and again for justice on behalf of the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor. And what all of those would have had in common in this society is that all of them were powerless. And so the test case of whether or not you are doing righteousness, the test case of whether or not you are living in right relationship, is how you are relating with those who are powerless. Now, it seems that Isaiah sort of limits the scope of his all those that we live in right relationship with. He limits that scope to those who are part of the kingdom of Judah, or those who are part of ethnic Israel, those who are descendants of Abraham. But then Jesus comes along. We're going to look at this next week during service in the park. Jesus comes along and quotes from Isaiah, appropriates Isaiah for himself, and Jesus seems to radically expand the all with whom we are called to live in right relationship. So that it is no longer just those who are related to me or part of my same nation, but this all now includes truly all. So for Jesus, yes, we are concerned about the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, and the poor. We are concerned about all those who are powerless, and we are also concerned with how we live in right relationship even with our enemies. That's how Jesus expands the vision of the prophet Isaiah. So we're going to be journeying through this prophet together, or this series of prophets, however you want to make sense of this lengthy and complex book. And we're going to learn all sorts of interesting things about the history in which Isaiah spoke, and we're going to learn about how that the prophecies of Isaiah continue to speak to us today. But all along, we're going to come back to this central belief: that when we face a crisis, whatever you would define as a crisis, when we face something that is threatening and dangerous, our response that is formed and shaped by our faith is that we trust God. And we trust God to act justly, that God will use God's power to do good in the world. God will act justly even in the face of crisis and danger. And because we are building our trust in God, we can live in right relationship with all of those around us. We can learn to do good, to seek justice, to rescue the oppressed, to defend the orphan, to plead for the widow. We can be redeemed by justice, and as we repent, by righteousness. Because God is able to act. And because God acts justly, we can live in right relationship with all those around us. Would you pray with me? Gracious and merciful God, we give you thanks for the teaching and testimony of the prophet Isaiah, for the ways that he was faithful in delivering your word to people in the midst of crisis. And we pray, God, as we journey through crises of our own, threats and dangers that we don't fully comprehend or know how to respond to, we pray, God, that we would respond with faith, that we would respond by trusting you to act justly, and that the trust we put in you would empower us to live in right relationship with all of those around us. We pray that you would do this work within us by the power of your Holy Spirit, and we pray this in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.